A man was sleeping on the plane until the captain asked in terror, "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" The trembling voice of co-pilot David Chen echoed through the aircraft sound system as the Boeing 747 flew through one of the worst storms ever recorded over the North Atlantic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious medical emergency. Captain Harris is unconscious, and I need immediate assistance from anyone with combat aviation experience." In row 23C, Kyle Jackson slowly opened his eyes. At 34, he had learned to sleep anywhere, a habit developed during years of missions where rest was a rare luxury. But something in the desperation of that voice made him sit up instantly. Beside her husband, businesswoman Victoria Sterling, adjusted her designer glasses and muttered as if anyone qualified would be traveling in economy class. Her disdainful gaze swept over Kyle, who was wearing simple jeans and a basic t-shirt, his short hair neatly trimmed. Turbulence shook the plane violently as rain hammered the windows with deafening force. Among the 312 passengers, panic was beginning to set in. Children cried, people prayed aloud, and some were already typing farewell messages on their cell phones. "Please," David's voice cracked over the intercom. "Anyone with military aviation training, identify yourself immediately. We are flying blind through a Category 5 storm, and I've never faced anything like this alone." Kyle stood still for a moment, watching the terrified faces around him. He noticed how no one considered him a possibility. To them, he was just another ordinary passenger, a black man traveling alone, probably visiting family or returning from some simple job. Victoria Sterling stood up abruptly. "Listen here, kid!" she yelled toward the cockpit. "My sister is a private pilot. I've flown with her dozens of times. I can help." A flight attendant came running over. "Ma'am, we need someone with specific military experience. Civilian training isn't enough for these conditions." "Are you doubting me?" Victoria puffed out her chest, her arrogance intact, even in the face of chaos. "I paid $15,000 for these first-class seats. I have more experience than anyone else on this plane." It was then that Kyle stood up quietly. His movements were fluid, precise, unlike the desperate agitation of the other passengers. As he walked down the aisle toward the cockpit, some passengers watched him with curiosity, others with obvious skepticism. "Excuse me," he said to the flight attendant, his calm voice contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. "Colonel Kyle Jackson, Air Force, 500 hours of flight time in F-22 Raptors, expert in navigation under extreme conditions." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria Sterling stared at him in utter disbelief, her mouth open in shock. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. But in Kyle's eyes was something that made the flight attendant take a step back, an absolute calm that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms and lived to tell the tale, something that suggested well-kept secrets and a silent strength that was about to be revealed. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple passenger would turn the most terrifying flight of their lives into the most epic demonstration of why we should never judge someone by their appearance. Victoria Sterling's bitter laughter echoed through the cabin as the storm continued to batter the Boeing 747. "Colonel, you," she gestured dismissively toward him. "Look, I respect our military, but I'm not going to bet my life on a fantasy. My husband and I paid a fortune for these seats precisely to avoid situations like this." Other passengers began to murmur among themselves. An elderly man in first class whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is he really qualified? He looks so young." The subtext was clear and painful. David Chen appeared at the cabin door, his face pale with terror. "Please, anyone with military experience needs to come forward now. Captain Harris is having seizures and I've never flown solo in conditions like this." His voice broke on the last word. "Listen here, young man." Victoria stood up again, puffing out her chest. "I've flown in private jets all over Europe. I have over 200 hours of experience as a passenger in luxury aircraft. I know all the procedures." Kyle remained silent for a moment, observing the dynamic. He had learned during years of military service that certain battles had to be chosen carefully. But when he saw the genuine despair in the young co-pilot's eyes, something inside him awakened. The same force that had sustained him during impossible missions in hostile territory. "Mr. Chen," he said calmly, "I need to know our current altitude, speed, and exact weather conditions." "We're at 38,000 FT, speed 450 knots. Cross winds of 120 km/h with gusts up to 160, David replied automatically. Recognizing the authority in his voice, Victoria let out a cruel laugh. Impressive. He memorized some numbers from Wikipedia. That doesn't make him a pilot. It was then that Kyle did something that silenced the entire cabin. Without hesitation, he began to recite, "Emergency procedure for loss of pressurization at cruising altitude. Immediate oxygen mask, emergency descent to 10,000 ft. Descent angle not exceeding 15 degrees to avoid structural stress. Communication with air traffic control code 7700. He continued for another 2 minutes, detailing procedures that only highly trained military pilots would know by heart. The ensuing silence was broken only by the roar of the storm. David Chen stared at him with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Sir, the cockpit is yours." But Victoria Sterling wasn't finished. "1 minute. Anyone can memorize procedures. I demand to see proper credentials before I entrust my life to someone who clearly does not belong in first class on an international flight." The words cut through the air like blades. Other passengers avoided eye contact, embarrassed but unwilling to confront the powerful woman. Kyle felt the familiar burn of injustice, the same one he had experienced countless times during his military career, when he had to prove his competence twice as much as any man or white colleague. For a moment, memories flooded his mind. The first time he was questioned during a combat mission, when a white general publicly doubted his ability to lead a fighter formation. The time he was passed over for a promotion, despite having the best flight record in his class. The whispered comments about racial quotas that had followed him throughout his career. But he also remembered what had made him the most decorated pilot of his generation. The ability to turn every doubt into fuel, every insult into motivation, every underestimation into a strategic advantage. "Ms. Sterling," he said finally, his voice laden with a calm that made some passengers shiver. "There are 3 kinds of pilots in this world: those who fly when it's easy, those who fly when it's hard, and those who fly when it's impossible." He took a step toward the cockpit, then stopped. "During my career, I have saved 17 aircraft in situations that the manual said were unrecoverable. But what really qualifies me for this moment is not my medals or flight hours." The plane dove violently, causing several passengers to scream. Kyle didn't even brace himself, maintaining his balance with the ease of someone who had faced turbulence far worse than atmospheric storms. "What qualifies me," he continued, "is that I am the only person on this plane who has ever flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, a destroyed navigation system, and missiles being fired at my aircraft, and I still brought my entire squadron home." Kyle nodded and began walking toward the cockpit. But before passing Victoria, he turned one last time. "Ms. Sterling, when we reach the ground, and we will, perhaps you will reflect on how a black man who doesn't belong in first class saved your life and that of your family." As he disappeared into the cockpit, the passengers fell silent. Some began to realize that they might have witnessed something much greater than a simple air emergency. And Victoria Sterling, for the first time in decades, felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The painful and inevitable feeling of being completely, devastatingly wrong about someone whose worth she had underestimated, based purely on prejudices that now seemed not only cruel, but dangerously stupid. What none of them knew was that Kyle Jackson carried with him not only exceptional flying skills, but also a personal history that would make every condescending word they had heard bitterly ironic. A history that, when revealed, would forever change the way everyone on that plane viewed courage, competence, and the true meaning of heroism. Inside the cockpit, Kyle Jackson was faced with a situation that would have sent any commercial pilot into a full-blown panic. Captain Harris was convulsing violently in his seat, foam coming out of his mouth as the heart monitors blared deafening alarms. David Chen was literally frozen in terror, his hands shaking over controls he could no longer operate. "First aid now," Kyle ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. He checked the captain's vital signs with the precision of someone who had treated wounded pilots in combat zones. "We have approximately 15 minutes before he goes into full cardiac arrest." David watched him work, impressed by how economical and precise his movements were. "Colonel, how do you know so much about emergency medicine?" 10 years flying rescue missions in hostile territory," he replied, adjusting the navigation instruments while simultaneously monitoring the captain's vital signs. "When you're the only person between a wounded soldier and death, you learn a few things." Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, Victoria Sterling had convinced half of first class that they were all doomed because of an imposter at the controls. Did you see how he was dressed? Qualified people don't travel like that, she muttered to anyone willing to listen. I bet he doesn't even have a valid pilot's license. Her husband, Robert, who had been silent until then, finally confronted her. Victoria, stop it. You're being ridiculous. Ridiculous? She turned to him indignant. I'm trying to save our lives. I'm not going to leave our safety in the hands of someone who clearly doesn't… Her words were interrupted by the sound of Kyle's voice over the intercom, now assuming full command. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Jackson speaking. I will be taking command of this aircraft until we reach our destination. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the crew. The authority in his voice was unmistakable. It was not the tone of someone trying to convince or impress, but of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Even Victoria felt an involuntary chill. In the cockpit, Kyle had transformed David Chen from a paralyzed co-pilot into an efficient assistant. David, I need you to monitor our fuel and pressurization systems. I'm going to get us out of this storm, but I need accurate information every 30 seconds. Yes, sir, David replied, his confidence returning for the first time since the emergency began. There was something about Kyle's presence that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get out of this alive. Then he did something that left David completely perplexed. Instead of following standard emergency routes, Kyle began mentally calculating a trajectory that seemed impossible, flying through the storm instead of trying to get around it. Colonel, with all due respect, this goes against all safety protocols, David protested, watching the calculations he scribbled on a notepad. Kyle smiled for the first time since taking command. David, let me tell you something. In 2018, I was leading a rescue mission in Afghanistan when our aircraft was hit by surface-to-air missiles. 2 engines failed, the navigation system was destroyed, and a sandstorm reduced visibility to 0. He continued flying as he spoke, his hands moving over the controls with mesmerizing fluidity. The manual said to eject and abandon the mission, but there were 17 wounded soldiers depending on us. So I did exactly what I'm doing now. I threw the manual out the window and trusted my experience. And what happened? I brought them all home. All 17 of them. His words carried a weight that made David understand he was in the presence of someone truly exceptional. Sometimes David, following the rules, kills people. Knowing the rules well enough to break them at the right time is what separates mediocre pilots from pilots who save lives. At that moment, the cabin door swung open. Victoria Sterling had managed to convince a flight attendant to let her through, claiming she had relevant experience to assess the situation. This is utter madness, she declared, observing Kyle's unconventional calculations. You're putting us all in danger. I demand to speak to air traffic control immediately. Kyle didn't even turn to look at her. Ms. Sterling, this cockpit is no place for tourists. Please return to your seat. Tourist? Victoria's voice rose an octave. I've flown in more private jets than you in your entire life. I know aviation, and what you're doing is collective suicide. That's when something interesting happened. Dr. Michael Thorne, chief of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, who had remained quiet until that moment, got up from first class and walked to the cockpit. Colonel Jackson, he said calmly. I'm Dr. Thorne, a neurosurgeon. I worked for 3 years in military hospitals, treating pilots with neurological injuries. I can help with Captain Harris. Kyle finally turned around, and the two professionals recognized each other instantly, not personally, but as people who had dedicated their lives to saving others in extreme conditions. Doctor, it would be an honor to have you with us. The captain is stable at the moment, but we need constant monitoring. Victoria watched this exchange with growing frustration. You're all crazy. This is a conspiracy to kill us. Dr. Thorne looked at her with the patience of someone who had dealt with hysterical family members during medical crises. Ms. Sterling, I've treated hundreds of military pilots. This man has the kind of training that no amount of money can buy. I suggest you trust him. Trust? Victoria laughed bitterly. Based on what? His word. It was then that Kyle did something that completely changed the dynamics of the situation. Without stopping flying, he said calmly, David, please tune to military emergency frequency 121.5 and identify our position to Andrews Air Force Base. Colonel Jackson to Andrews Base, requesting identity. Confirmation for civil emergency, he said into the radio. The response came immediately. Colonel Jackson, Spectre, is that really you? This is Commander Rodriguez, Military Air Traffic Control. We confirm your identity. Spectre, you disappeared from radar 20 minutes ago. The entire Air Force is mobilized looking for you. The cabin fell completely silent. Victoria Sterling turned pale, finally realizing that she had completely misjudged one of the most decorated pilots in American military history. Andrews Air Force Base, Kyle continued. We have a simultaneous medical and weather emergency. Captain incapacitated, flying through an unforeseen storm system. Requesting coordinates for emergency landing at the nearest airport with Boeing 747 capability. Spectre, you have top priority. All airspace on the East Coast has been cleared for you. We have emergency medical equipment being directed to Baltimore International Airport. Dr. Thorne smiled discreetly when he saw Victoria's expression. Do you know many tourists who have the entire Air Force mobilized to help them, Ms. Sterling? But what none of them knew was that this emergency was just beginning. In the next few minutes, Kyle Jackson would have to use not only his elite piloting skills, but also secret knowledge acquired during classified missions that even his military superiors did not fully know about. And when the true extent of his capabilities was revealed, Victoria Sterling would discover that she had underestimated not only an exceptional pilot, but a true living legend of American military aviation, someone whose story would forever change her view of competence, courage, and the true meaning of heroism. Andrews Base to Spectre. We have critical information. Commander Rodriguez's voice echoed through the cockpit. The weather system is intensifying beyond all predictions. Winds of 180 km/h, hail the size of baseballs. All airports in the region are closing their runways. You are the only aircraft still in the air. The reality of the situation hit Victoria Sterling like a punch in the stomach. They weren't just another commercial flight with technical problems. They were literally flying through a meteorological apocalypse that had closed all airspace on the East Coast. David, he said calmly, I'm going to need you to monitor our vertical speed. We're going to do something that has never been attempted in a Boeing 747. His hands danced over the controls with a precision that made it seem as if the aircraft was an extension of his own body. Colonel, what exactly are we going to do? David asked, watching indicators that suggested maneuvers impossible for a commercial aircraft of that size. Controlled spiral descent through the eye of the storm, he replied, beginning to perform mental calculations that left both David and Dr. Thorne impressed, a technique developed for military fighter jets never attempted in a civilian aircraft of this size. Victoria felt her legs buckle. During her business career, she had met some truly exceptional people, but never anyone operating at such an advanced level of competence that it seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Spectre, another military controller's voice interrupted. This is General Michael Hayes, Pentagon Air Operations Command. We have confirmed that it was your mission to save two other aircraft during Operation Tempest Shield in 2019. Is it true that you guided a malfunctioning C-130 through a sandstorm, using only radio communication? Affirmative, General. Similar situation, different atmospheric variables, Kyle replied, as he simultaneously adjusted flight angles that made the Boeing 747 dance through air currents that should have destroyed any aircraft. David was speechless. Colonel, you saved other planes just by giving instructions over the radio. 17 aircraft throughout my military career, he confirmed, his concentration unshaken. When you learn to see atmospheric patterns in 3 dimensions, you can guide anything that flies, even without being physically at the controls. It was at that moment that Victoria Sterling had a devastating epiphany about the true extent of her ignorance. The man she had judged based on appearances was not just a competent pilot. He was a living legend of military aviation, someone whose skills were studied in academies around the world. Dr. Thorne, Kyle said, I need you to monitor Captain Harris. What I'm about to do in the next few minutes will subject us all to G-forces that could affect his medical condition. Understood, Colonel. He's stable, but you're right about the G-forces. General Hayes, Kyle continued over the radio, requesting confirmation that all civilian aircraft have been directed to alternate airports. I don't want anyone trying to follow our trajectory. Spectre, you are the only thing flying in American airspace right now. We have 13 military bases monitoring your situation. The President has been personally briefed. Victoria felt the world spinning around her. The President of the United States was being informed about the flight she was traveling on, piloted by a man she had tried to disqualify based on racial prejudice. David, I need you to take over communications with air traffic control while I execute the descent, Kyle instructed. I'm going to need total concentration on the next maneuvers. Colonel Jackson, Victoria finally spoke, her voice broken with humiliation. I need to apologize. What I said was, Miss Sterling, he interrupted her without diverting his attention from the controls. Your apologies can wait. Right now, I need to save your life, and everyone else is on board. The aircraft began a spiral descent that defied all the laws of commercial aeronautical physics. Kyle had found a descending column in the center of the storm, a relatively stable air tunnel that would allow for a controlled descent below the layer of severe turbulence. My God, David murmured, watching the instruments. How did you know that current existed? 10 years flying through hostile weather systems in the Middle East, he replied. Sandstorms, man-made hurricanes created by explosions, conditions that don't exist in civilian manuals. When you survive the impossible repeatedly, the extraordinary becomes routine. Spectre, this is Commander Rodriguez. We're seeing your trajectory on radar. This is impossible. How are you keeping an aircraft of this size stable while descending 4,000 ft per minute? Applied physics, Commander, and 17 years of experience, turning impossible situations into safe landings. Victoria watched through the window as they descended through the eye of the storm. Lightning streaked across the walls of clouds around them like apocalyptic fireworks. But the aircraft remained strangely stable, as if guided by forces beyond normal human comprehension. General Hayes, Kyle called over the radio, requesting coordinates for Dover Air Force Base. We'll need a runway with full emergency capability and medical personnel on standby. Spectre, Dover is ready. Main runway cleared. Emergency foam being applied. Ambulances in position. You have absolute priority over all airspace. David, when we touch down, you'll see why they call me Spectre, said Kyle, a barely perceptible smile touching his lips for the first time since he had taken command. Over the next 15 minutes, Victoria Sterling would witness a display of technical skill and personal courage that would completely redefine her understanding of competence, leadership, and the true meaning of heroism. And when they finally touched down, she would discover that Kyle Jackson was not only one of the best pilots in American military history, he was someone whose personal story of overcoming adversity would make every prejudiced word she had ever uttered a bitter and unforgettable irony. What none of the passengers yet knew was that this landing would change not only their lives, but also civil aviation policies, emergency protocols, and the way the whole world would see what a truly exceptional person can achieve when underestimated by those who confuse privilege with competence. 6 months after the miraculous landing, Kyle Jackson was promoted to Brigadier General in a ceremony at the Pentagon, becoming the youngest black man in history to achieve such a rank. His storm navigation technique was incorporated into military training manuals worldwide, and 3 universities offered chairs in his name. General Jackson saved not only 312 lives that day, the Secretary of Defense declared during the ceremony. He redefined how we evaluate competence versus appearance in our armed forces. In the audience, Dr. Michael Thorne applauded enthusiastically. He had co-authored an article with Kyle on emergency aviation medicine published in the world's most prestigious medical journal. David Chen, now a captain, commanded his own commercial aircraft, always crediting Kyle as his greatest inspiration. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling faced the reality of her choices. The video of her prejudiced comments during the emergency had leaked on social media, going viral with over 50 million views. Her investment firm lost 80% of its clients in 3 months, forcing her to file for personal bankruptcy. "Mommy, why do people get mad when they see your name on Google?" asked her 12-year-old son, innocently destroying what remained of her pride. Robert had filed for divorce, taking half of the remaining assets and full custody of the children. "I married a woman who admired success," he told the judge. "I discovered that I had lived for 15 years with someone who confuses privilege with competence." Victoria now worked as a salesperson at a used car dealership using public transportation, the same ordinary life she had once despised. Every morning, she passed a giant billboard in the city centre showing Kyle in military uniform with the words, "Leadership has no colour, it has character." During a lecture at the Air Force Academy, Kyle was asked by a cadet how to deal with prejudice. "Young man," he replied, "let them underestimate you. While they spend their energy doubting your abilities, you use that same energy to develop skills they can never question." Kyle's story inspired an entire generation of young military personnel from minority backgrounds. His book, Flying Through the Storms, became a bestseller with all proceeds going toward aviation scholarships. 3 years later, Victoria ran into Kyle at an airport. He was wearing a general's uniform, surrounded by aides and security guards. She was wearing her blue dealership uniform, carrying a small, inexpensive suitcase. "General Jackson," she said timidly, "I would like to properly apologize for what happened on that flight." Kyle studied her for a moment, seeing not the arrogant woman from before, but someone genuinely broken by her own ignorance. "Miss Sterling, you gave me the greatest gift possible that day. How so?" "You reminded me why I do what I do. Every person I save, every pilot I train, every barrier I break, all of it is possible because people like you exist to motivate me to prove them wrong." Victoria nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I lost everything because of my prejudices." "No, ma'am," Kyle corrected her gently. "You discovered you never had anything real to lose. Privilege is not achievement. Respect is not inheritance. Competence is not appearance." As he walked away with his team, Victoria realized the hardest lesson of her life. The man she had judged incapable of flying a plane now commanded entire squadrons, while she, who considered herself superior, could barely command her own existence. Kyle's true revenge was not to destroy Victoria Sterling. It was to build a legacy so brilliant that it rendered her pettiness irrelevant. He learned that success is not only the best revenge, it is the only revenge worth having. As he said in his last interview, "While they spend time underestimating us, we spend that time becoming unforgettable." Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later realized they had made the biggest mistake of their life? Leave your story of overcoming adversity in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that prove that greatness doesn't ask permission to shine.